Sharit Sedek is honored to have Rachel Hercman as one of our guest speakers today. Rachel Hercman is a Manhattan-based psychotherapist specializing in relationships, sexual health, and trauma. She's graduated CUNY Queens College with a BA in History and Secondary Education and earned an MSW as a Merit Scholar at Worthwell School of Social Work. Rachel's passionate about opening up communal conversations and utilizing social media for mental health awareness. She's been the clinical director of the Layers Project since its online launch in 2017 and edited Layers' personal narratives of struggle, resilience, and growth from Jewish women by Shira Lincoln Shafts, recently released by Corin Publishers. It is our pleasure to welcome Rachel Hercman, who will speak about the next level, the gift and grit of resilience.
Can you hear me okay? Too loud or good? So what is resilience? We hear that word thrown around all the time. We often say it in a complimentary way when we're talking about someone. We say, oh, they've been through X and Y, but they're so resilient. Or as a Jewish community, we often talk with a certain amount of pride. Look at what we've been through, and yet we push forward. We're so resilient. On the way here, I was thinking even about how Sharit said that, being in Jerusalem. When you think about Jerusalem and Jerusalem's history and its trauma history, I think you could say Jerusalem has been through a lot, and yet it's still standing. So resilience is very much part of our communal framework, and in the last couple of years, it's definitely attracted more interest and attention in the psychology world in terms of what does it mean to be resilient? What are the factors? What helps people get through difficult things? Can we cultivate resilience? And I often think about resilience, obviously from my own life and things I've been through. Think about it as a therapist, being alongside people as we're processing different things. And when we talk about resilience, we're not just talking about adversity. Very often we think about resilience in those terms of these big things. But there's also the resilience of everyday life and everyday living. And resilience is powerful and it's deeply personal. And I also think about resilience from the perspective of communal conversations. So a couple of years ago, I got involved with something called the Layers Project. Online, it's a magazine for Jewish women. And we also we came out with a book recently that tells stories of Jewish women in Israel. And what was very important to us in talking about these stories and talking about these women's experiences is that most stories you can't neatly tie with a bow. Very often, and I feel like growing up, I definitely heard a lot of, in the Jewish community, when I would hear stories, they often had that kind of neat ending. Everything worked out the way it should. Oh, the guy overslept on 9/11, so he missed his train, right? Everything had this kind of neat thing at the end. But the truth is, most people's stories and experiences don't necessarily have a neat ending, cannot easily be tied with a bow. And so when we're talking about resilience, it invites us to open up conversations in a way that we may not have done in the past. And so I'd like to unpack this concept for a bit, give it a little more language, asking ourselves, what does it mean to us to be resilient? What does the concept mean to us? How does it impact our expectations of ourselves and other people through experiences? And finally, how, as a community, can we cultivate more of it and connect with each other more, while also making space for the many nuances that exist? So whenever I'm researching a concept, I like to look at its root in Latin. It's always interesting to me to see where words come from, what they originally meant. So when I was looking up the word resilience, there were a few definitions that came up, and they were this: the act of rebounding or springing back, to leap, to recoil, and interestingly, to shrink from. That was one of the definitions that came up also. And then I was interested to see the definition of resilience from a science perspective. So in material science, and I apologize if there's scientists here who feel that this wasn't the right definition, I apologize. I tried to do my best. One of the definitions I saw was resilience is the ease with which a material returns to its original shape after an elastic deformation. From a physics perspective, resilience is the amount of potential energy, and potential energy really kind of resonated with me. Amount of potential energy stored in an elastic material that can be released to enable the body to return to its original shape. Now, this idea of returning to original shape is something that is often associated with resilience. And I find that when people go through difficult things, one of the ways that people will try to comfort them is to say, don't worry, you'll get back to yourself, everyone bounces back, you'll be able to bounce back. And very often in those moments, that's exactly what people want to hear, right? When we're going through something, and if it's something significant, where it creates a sort of before and after in our lives, which everyone has. Everyone has before and after moments. Moments in your life, situations in your life, where there was a before and there was an after. And sometimes during that experience, you're very aware of it as it's happening. Sometimes you only get that perspective when you're looking back in retrospect. But when you think about it, it's very interesting how when we say to people, you'll bounce back, you'll get back to yourself, what we're basically saying to them is, there's a before and there's an after, but don't worry, you will be able to get back to your before, even though that before is no longer the reality. And what that does is, sometimes, is it sets us up with certain expectations of how we are supposed to be coping through something, what that is supposed to look like, and what that is supposed to feel like. And the truth is that whenever we go through something that challenges us, it changes us. We don't stay the same. So when we talk about bouncing back, what does bouncing back actually mean? And I was thinking about how when you bounce a ball, so it might bounce back, but it usually doesn't bounce back to the exact spot that it was before. So maybe it won't be as low as it got, but the place it goes is probably not going to be the exact spot that it was before. It's not exact, it's not certain, and resilience has that to it. It's not exact, it's not a formula, it's not a recipe. So when we're thinking for ourselves about what does resilience mean to me, and we ask ourselves that question, part of it means thinking back to what are the messages that we got about resilience? What are the messages we got about what it means to move forward? The messages we got about how to deal with life. The messages we got before something difficult. Did anyone even speak to us about that? Was there even language for that? I still remember actually a couple of years ago, so I went through something very difficult after my fourth child was born. I had a lung tumor. Thank God I'm fine now. It was nothing major in terms of needing long treatment, but I needed to have part of my lungs removed. And I remember my surgeon saying to me, listen, it's a very quick surgery, just gonna get in there, we're gonna cut out your right lower lobe, you'll be out of the hospital in 2 days, and yeah, and then you just like go on with your life, you're gonna be great. Now, at the time, did I want to hear that? That was perfect. It was exactly what I needed to hear. It was like a classic perfect surgeon response. If there are any surgeons here, I'm not saying you're all like that, but it was a very, it was so good because it was very much like, you're gonna go through this, it's like gonna be a drive-through thing, it's gonna be a nuisance, and then you're gonna continue on, right? Now, thank God I've fully recovered, and in a way I have bounced back, very much so. But I'm not the same person I was before that, absolutely not. I literally lost a part of myself, and I went through an experience that required me to dig into that potential energy, right? So when we're going through these things, and we hear those messages, which speaks to something I'm going to get to later in terms of how we talk to people when they're going through something difficult, because we could say something that at that moment is exactly what they need to hear, but in another moment isn't what they would need to hear. In fact, a couple months ago, some colleagues and I were doing an Instagram Live about stupid things people say to people going through something difficult. And we ask people to write in, can you share something that someone once said to you during a time of challenge that you found very helpful to hear? Can you share something that was very hopeful for you to hear? Can you share something that was really not helpful? And guess what we found? We had the same responses in every single category, okay? There were people who wrote that it was so helpful that someone said to them, God doesn't give you anything you can't handle. There were people who wrote that in their unhelpful category. There were people who said it was really helpful for them when someone said, this is really hard. That must be so hard. I can't imagine what you're going through. There are people who put that in their unhelpful category. It was so fascinating to see how there was so much variation, and it also depended on where the person was at in dealing with that experience. And it also depends on who's the person saying it to you, because that's a big part of this too. And so when we look at resilience and we look at ourselves, and we look at what we've been through ourselves, and we ask, how did I get through that? What was helpful for me? Were there beliefs that I was able to rely on? Were there people in my life? For some people, I find there are some families where grandchildren of Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors find strength in thinking about people in their family who got through things. And this is a long conversation about trauma, which we won't get into, but everyone is different in terms of how seeing other people go through things is helpful in that way. And one person's resilience can be another person's routine. So there are people in this tent right now who it took everything for them to get out of bed this morning. There are people in this room, in this tent, they didn't even have to think twice about it. There are people here who have been through loss and challenges and things that completely shattered them. And then there are people who went through those same things and it didn't. There are people here who were deeply impacted by COVID, physically, emotionally, financially. And there are people who feel like it didn't really affect them that much. Now it's hard to measure this from a research perspective in terms of control groups and things like that. But two people can go through the same thing or be doing the same thing. And for one person, it could be incredibly resilient and it requires that resilience from them to do that. Whereas for another person, it's not a big deal. In other words, something that might be like a marathon for one person, for another person is like a walk in the park. And what this can do though, is that it can set up our expectations. And when it sets up our expectations, it becomes part of the way we talk to ourselves when we're going through something. So very often those statements will start with things like, I should be over this. I shouldn't be upset about this. Or this should bother me more. Because on one hand, and I find this happens sometimes, where we need permission to feel that it's okay to not be okay, but it's also okay to be okay. In other words, just because someone is going through something and they seem like they're okay, it doesn't mean, oh, they must be in denial, oh, it's gonna hit the fan later, right? It's also okay to be okay. And when we look at resilience and we look at our picture of it, how do we picture a person who's resilient? What do we think are the things that they might say? Very often, people think of resilience as something that is consistent. In other words, that if someone is resilient, they always feel that way, or they're always able to push forward, and that they don't have conflicting feelings necessarily, and that they have something inspiring to share. And I've noticed, I've heard this from a lot of people, that Shiva houses have unfortunately kind of leaned to this space now where when someone is sitting Shiva, they feel like they're hosted, they have to host people, and whereas a Shiva house is supposed to be that the Avel, the mourner, can sit quietly if they want. People sometimes will come into a Shiva house and be sitting there kind of waiting, like, tell me something interesting about this person. I want to hear about them. Tell me something inspiring, or tell me how you're doing so that I can get strength from you. Which not everyone is in a place to do that, or even want to do that. And a couple of years ago for the Layers Project, we interviewed Rachel Frankel, who is the mother of one of the 3 boys who was kidnapped and murdered. And she was actually a Torah scholar even before this happened, but she became a lot more well-known after that. And she said something I never forgot in the interview. She said, you know, very often when people are trying to give someone strength to be encouraging, they'll say, you know, be strong, be strong. And she said that when she goes to a Shiva house to be Menachem Avel, she whispers in the ear of the mourner and says, Al tihiyu chazakin, don't be strong, tihiyu gemishim, be flexible. I won't say it again. Don't be strong, be flexible. In other words, her message of people feeling that in this moment we need to be strong, and she's saying, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay not to feel strong, or it's okay if strength is not your goal in this experience. It's about being flexible. And so when we go back to the idea of resilience, and when we look at it not so much in the sense of what does it mean to be strong, but what does it mean to be flexible? What does it mean to adapt? What does it mean to adapt? And kids struggle with adapting, adults struggle with adapting. And one of the hardest parts about adapting, and I think any adult you talk to long enough, you will hear about a dream that they had to grieve. I would say everybody has dreams that they've had to grieve. Pictures of how they thought their life would be, how they hoped their life would be, experiences that they thought or hoped would never happen to them, but have happened to them. Everyone has those experiences. And so one of the hard parts about adapting is being able to also make space to grieve and to let go of whatever that picture might have been, of what someone hoped their life would look like and what they hoped that their life would feel like. So how do we adapt? How do we adapt? Is that something we're just naturally born with? Is that something we work on? I think it's probably a little bit of both, right? The nature-nurture thing is a much longer discussion, but I think people have their personalities and temperaments, but it is something that people can work on within themselves. And one of the first places we can go when we're talking about resilience and coping is what is our own experience with our feelings in general. Are we able to be with our feelings? Do we give ourselves permission to even acknowledge feelings? And when we start with that, we can understand more of how we may be going into places of avoidance when something painful is coming up. So one of the analogies I like to use about feelings and avoidance is, you know, if you're using your computer and you want to print something out. So let's say you press print, but let's say your printer's not plugged in, or it's not hooked up to your computer. So what happens if you press print? Nothing's gonna come out, right? It's offline. What then happens usually when you do then hook up the printer properly? And now it's back online. Usually there's like a lot of papers that start shooting out. And it's like a print job from today, and it's like something you tried to print out 2 months ago, like tickets to a show. This, all of a sudden, all these other things start coming out of the printer now that it's back online. Very often our feelings can work the same way when we're in a place of survival mode and going through challenges. We're overwhelmed, we're dealing with a lot of things at once, so it's like a part of us, part of our nervous system, our emotions kind of goes offline because we're just dealing what we have to deal with. But what then can happen is that once we're kind of more back online or more in a space for emotions to be there, there could be a sense of overwhelming feelings, which then, by the way, can feed into a cycle of, well, if my feelings are so overwhelming, maybe I should just numb out. And then we keep a cycle going. So one of the ways that we can try to challenge that cycle is by having more space and permission to have our feelings on a regular basis, as opposed to it getting to a point where it just floods and then all those different print jobs are shooting out. One of the hard parts I find for people is this sense of when they're going through something difficult and they're like, I want to be resilient, I want to go through this, what is the recipe for this? They want steps, right? They want steps. How do we fix this? How do we make this go away? And I always picture, you ever see Dirty Dancing? Anyone? Okay. I kind of know it by heart. And one of my favorite scenes is when Patrick Swayze is Johnny's teaching Baby how to dance, and she keeps stepping on his toes, right? And like he puts her hand on his heart, and like hungry eyes, right? It's like, when I love that montage, it's awesome. And one of the things he says to her is, don't step on the ones, because she keeps, stepping on his toes. But he says, the steps aren't enough. You need to feel the music. And anyone who's taken dance or learned, it's very much about feeling the music, right? It's not just about learning steps. So when we are going through something difficult, very often we go into this place of trying to figure it out. Let's figure it out. But there's also this aspect of feeling it out, of sitting with our feelings about it and listening to that music. Because when we listen to that music, that's when we learn more about ourselves. We also learn more about what we might need in that moment, right? Very often people will try to be there for someone and say, what can I do for you? I want to help you. Are you? And it's normal for people to not know what they need. They know they're struggling, but they don't necessarily know what they need. So when we're going through something difficult and we can find ways to be more attuned to what feelings we're having and to feel that music more, we are then in a position to be more aware of how we can communicate that to other people as well. One of the quotes I like, did anyone here read, Dr. Edith Eger? She wrote The Choice. So she's like an Energizer bunny. Like she just keeps going and going. She's awesome. So Dr. Edith Eger is a Holocaust survivor who has written amazing stuff. She's also a psychologist. She's written a lot about trauma and being able to find vibrancy in life despite the pain. And one of the things she says is that the opposite of depression is expression. What comes out of you doesn't make you sick. It's what stays inside that does. Which I thought was such one of those quotes you could read more than once. In other words, that when something stays inside, and everyone is different in terms of how they may need or benefit from expressing feelings. I don't believe that every single person needs to be like shouting their feelings to the world. That's not necessarily what this is about. But this idea of when we're holding something inside, we're holding feelings inside that are painful, and the tendency or temptation might be to avoid, when we can find other ways where the expression of that, the catharsis of that, it can shift the way our whole functioning works. So I want to pivot into talking a little bit as we, we're talking about community. We're here as a community, which I think just given what the last few years have been, it's so easy to take it for granted to have a get-together like this, when for so long these things were not a given. Is how is it as a community and socially, how can we do better in the way we talk to each other about challenges we go through, not just after we're going through, but even while we're going through it. And very often people talk about how people said the wrong things to them. And that can happen, I find, because people feel very uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. So they end up just, talking and talking. And I look at it as, when you're going through something, often you don't want pity, you want presence. In other words, if somebody's going to talk to you or say something to you, you want to feel like there's a certain presence there. And I noticed on Zoom, so Zoom has been very, very helpful for us therapists in terms of technology, and there's a lot of benefits to it. I find there's such a dramatic difference between therapy on Zoom and therapy in person. And one of the things I noticed that's different is this. When I'm on Zoom with someone, I find that there's maybe a max of like 3 or 4 seconds we can go of silence before there's a concern of, wait, can you hear me? Did we freeze? Did we lose the connection? Right? Zoom doesn't lend itself to a lot of silence. Because with Zoom, we have to announce our presence, right? It's like the only way you know I'm here is if we're talking. Whereas in person, when you're sitting with someone, you don't need to announce your presence because you can embody your presence. You could sit there in silence. And so what might feel like 4 seconds, that's very awkward from a technological perspective, often does not feel as awkward in person because there's a sense of presence. And so when we're talking to someone, or we hear that someone went through something difficult, and we want to say the right thing, it's not necessarily about saying the right thing, right? People don't want to feel, they want to feel seen, not solved. They want to feel like when they go out in public, people know that they went through something difficult, or they share something with someone else, that right away the person is just going to try to solve it for them, even though it's coming from a good place, right? Very often people want to feel at least that there's a sense of recognition, a sense of presence in that. And maybe the person does need encouragement that they will be able to bounce back. Maybe that's what they need in this moment, or maybe they don't need the person to say anything. And when we're reaching out to people when they're going through something difficult, I find there's real variations in terms of the effect of sending a text message or sending a voice note versus calling, right? I know there's some people who will say, you know, you should say to them, you know, I'm here for you, let me know how I can help. Others will say, what do you mean? You shouldn't put it on in, you should just show up with dinner, right? There are people who say, you should, right? But I think part of that, under all that, is that sense of, well, the person feels a sense of presence from you, that you recognize that they're going through something, and that you may or may not understand it, but that you're able to make space for their experience in that. And even just this idea of talking about struggles. One of my favorite acronyms is the word SHAME. I've heard this, SHAME stands for should have already mastered everything. Very often when people are going through something difficult, especially if it's something they've never been through before, there could be a sense of shame of, I am supposed to be able to master this thing that I didn't have preparation for, that maybe I've never been through before, and I'm just supposed to be able to be this person that I have in my mind. And that's where that comparison piece is not necessarily a comparison to someone else, but a comparison towards yourself and a certain ideal that you have. And this idea of what does it mean for us to normalize struggle? What does it mean for us to normalize that people have difficult feelings, that people can have multiple feelings about an experience, right? Someone could go through an experience and feel that they're getting through it, but also feel really upset or angry or whatever it might be. And that there's a difference between trying to comfort someone versus trying to control the narrative, which is what happens when people start listing reasons or giving cliches, and it falls and it doesn't land in a place that's helpful. And the whole I feel seen, which is now very big in social media, and it's more of this thing of, you know, we want to feel seen, we want to feel seen. So very often I find that when there are things that are very popular buzzwords, very often they have roots in the Torah. And I saw in Tehillim what I feel like is an original source of this concept of why does it feel positive to feel seen? And it doesn't always. There are people that don't find it helpful to feel seen, feel very vulnerable and very uncomfortable. But why is it that when we go through an experience and we feel seen in some way, it can be helpful? So in Tehillim, David HaMelech, King David says, Agila ve'esmacha b'chastecha, asher ra'ita et ani yadata v'tzarot nafshi. So, and here it is, King David is talking about like very painful things. This is not like a happy Pitel Tehillim. And David HaMelech says, I will be glad, I will be happy, or rejoice, b'chastecha, in your compassion, asher ra'ita et ani. You see my affliction, and you know the suffering of my soul. And it's not saying, it's not talking about Yeshua, it's not talking about being saved. It's not talking about being saved. It's talking about that sense of feeling seen and feeling known. And one of the commentaries, Sudat David says, on the words Asher Ra'ita, you saw, is Natata Lev Lerot. You gave heart to see. That's what empathy is. That's what making space for someone is, right? We can usually tell the difference if somebody is giving you their heart, so to speak, when they're sharing something with you, or giving you, a pep talk versus not. And so it's not really about necessarily saying the right stuff. I think cultivating resilience is not all about this is what we should say, follow that script. A lot of it is about feeling the music. A lot of it is about being able to sense things. And as we gain more perspective and more clarity of resilience, not just as a concept, and you could draw on your own experiences that you could look at and say, wow, look at some of the things I've been through. I was able to be resilient through that, right? Because people have a much easier time calling other people resilient and being like, oh my gosh, it's amazing that you went through that, that's so hard, wow, wow, wow. What about having that towards the self, right? There's something to that. And the more we can do that, and the more we can find that language and that permission, the more we have the tools and the skills, but also the presence to be able to show up differently in life, for each other, and for ourselves. So thank you so much. So nice to be here.